Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back, way back, to a time of sun-baked earth and the life-giving Nile. A place you probably won't survive with your modern sensibilities, to be honest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. There for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the warmth, don't you? A gentle, pervasive heat that radiates from the sandy earth beneath your feet, even as the sun begins its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and soft purple. You're standing near the banks of the majestic Nile, the lifeblood of this ancient land. Listen closely. You can hear the gentle lapping of water against the reeds, the distant calls of water birds, and perhaps the low hum of insects tuning up for their nightly serenade. The air smells of damp earth, river water, and somewhere kind of faintly, the scent of baking bread and cooking fires. This is ancient Egypt, in a time when gods and mortals walk a line so fine it's almost invisible. You see people moving with a rhythm dictated by the sun and the river. Farmers are returning from their fields, their skin burnished by the day's work, their tools resting on their shoulders. Children are laughing and darting through the narrow pathways between mud brick homes, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. Boats, with their tall curved prows, glide almost silently on the water, carrying goods, carrying people, carrying life up and down this great, watery highway. It's a scene of simple, enduring existence, a tapestry woven with threads of hard work, community, and a deep, abiding connection to the land and its divine protectors. You might even catch the scent of incense drifting from a nearby temple, a sweet, resinous aroma meant to please unseen deities. It's all so ancient, yet so alive. But beneath this veneer of timeless pastoral life, there's a quiet, persistent ache, a throb, a discomfort that affects nearly everyone, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest laborer. It's in their mouths. You see, their daily bread, the very staff of life here, is a bit of a double-edged sword, or perhaps a double-edged grindstone. The grain they cultivate so carefully, emmer wheat, barley, is ground by hand between stone slabs, and as you can imagine, tiny particles of stone, sand, and grit inevitably get mixed into the flour. So, every bite of that hearty, nutritious bread is also, unfortunately, an abrasive scrub against their teeth. It's like a rock opera for your molars, and not in a good way. Over time, this constant grinding wears down the enamel, exposing the sensitive dentin beneath. Imagine eating sandpaper sandwiches 3 times a day? Your teeth wouldn't thank you for it. So, you see people, young and old, wincing as they chew, or perhaps gently probing a sore spot in their jaw with a finger. Dental attrition, as it's known, is rampant. And with that comes a host of other delightful problems: cavities, painful abscesses, infections that can, and often do, turn life-threatening in an age before antibiotics. There's no gleaming white toothpaste aisle here, no friendly neighborhood hygienist with a cherry-flavored polish. If a tooth gets bad, really bad, the options are limited and generally unpleasant. You might try poultices, herbal rinses, maybe a little prayer to Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and destruction. So you'd want to be on her good side, but for direct intervention that was a rarer and perhaps scarier proposition. So, when that throbbing pain becomes unbearable, when the swelling in your jaw makes it impossible to eat or sleep, when you're desperate for relief, who do you turn to? Well, if you're fortunate enough, and perhaps living around 2670 BCE during the Third Dynasty, you might seek out a man named Hesi Re, Picture him a figure of some importance, likely well dressed by the standards of the time, perhaps with a calm, knowing gaze. He's not just any healer. His reputation suggests a particular skill with ailments of the mouth. You approach him, perhaps with a mixture of hope and trepidation, because let's be honest, even the thought of someone poking around in your sore mouth with ancient tools is enough to make you clench your jaw, if it weren't already throbbing. Heziri is a fascinating figure, and quite important for our little journey tonight. The mainstream historical fact you'll often hear about him is that his tomb inscriptions grant him the title Wer Ibesen Jauv, which is often translated as Chief of Dentists and Physicians, or Great One of the Ivory Cutters and Physicians. This makes him one of the earliest, if not the earliest individuals in history to be specifically identified with what we would recognize as dental practice. Imagine that on a business card, Heziri, Great One of the Toothers. It has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? This title suggests a level of official recognition and specialization, setting him apart from general healers. He wasn't just some guy with a pair of pliers, though. To be fair, pliers as we know them weren't exactly standard issue back then. Speaking of tools, that brings us to a quirky, lesser-known tidbit. The earliest dental tools were often ingeniously repurposed or incredibly simple. We're not talking about high-speed drills and tiny mirrors on sticks. Think more along the lines of fine bronze or gold wires, possibly used to bind loose teeth together, a sort of ancient dental bridge, or perhaps sharp flint points, carefully crafted, for lancing an abscess to relieve pressure. A quick, painful, but potentially life-saving procedure. Some speculate that bow drills, typically used for woodworking or starting fires, might have been adapted for certain dental procedures, though the evidence is debated. It's a testament to human ingenuity, really, using what's available to tackle a pervasive problem. You work with what you've got, especially when someone is moaning in agony beside you. It's not quite a Black & Decker from the Bronze Age, but they were certainly trying. Now, despite Heziri's rather impressive title, it's important to remember that our understanding of this period is always evolving. And this leads us to a classic, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether Nas O, Heziri and his contemporaries, even those designated as tooth workers, were truly specialized dentists in the modern, exclusive sense. Were they solely focused on teeth, day in and day out? Or was chief of dentists more of an honorific for a highly skilled physician who also happened to be particularly adept at treating oral afflictions? Among other medical duties, the lines were likely much blurrier back then. Specialization as we know it is a relatively modern concept. Perhaps Heziri was the go-to guy for a bad toothache, but he might also have set a broken bone or prescribed a remedy for a fever. The exact scope of his practice remains a wonderfully fuzzy area, perfect for late-night scholarly discussions and, well, sleepy. YouTube narrations like this one. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how these ancient roles were truly defined in the daily life of the Nile Valley, far removed from the neatly categorized professions we have today? And so, with that image still flickering in your mind's eye, you now find yourself turning a corner, perhaps down a slightly less grand alleyway, the scent of baking bread and something vaguely medicinal mingling in the air. Your jaw throbs, a dull and insistent ache that's been your unwelcome companion for days. You're seeking a different kind of artisan now, a specialist of a very particular and often dreaded domain, the mouth. You're looking for one of the physicians of the tooth. As you approach the modest dwelling or stall that serves as their practice, you notice it's probably not as ostentatious as the consulting rooms of a physician who diagnoses fevers or sets major bones. Their waiting room, if you could call it that, isn't exactly brimming with last month's magazines or a soothing water feature. More likely, it's a simple bench in a shaded spot, perhaps with another soul looking similarly apprehensive. Clutching their cheek, you take a seat, the stone cool beneath you, and try not to listen too intently to the occasional muffled groan or scrape emanating from within. It's not exactly spa day, is it? Eventually, you're beckoned inside. The light is dimmer here, shafts of dusty sunlight cutting through a small window or opening. The air is thick with the smell of herbs, perhaps a hint of something metallic, and maybe even a faint, lingering aroma of burnt tissue or clove, if they're using more advanced for the time remedies. You see the practitioner, and they're not usually clad in gleaming white robes. They might be a sturdy individual, their hands calloused but surprisingly deft, or perhaps a more scholarly type, with a keen, appraising look in their eye. They gesture for you to sit, not on a plush, reclining chair with adjustable headrests. Oh no, you might find yourself perched on a low stool, or even the floor, tilting your head back at an angle that feels designed to show off your double chin to its best advantage. Their status within the broader medical system is a fascinating thing. It's a well-documented fact, for instance, that in places like ancient Egypt, these specialists, sometimes called those who deal with teeth, or even great ones of the teeth, often held positions within the royal courts, indicating a certain level of recognized expertise and importance, even if they weren't always on par with the chief internist figuring out what ailed Pharaoh's liver. In other societies, they might have been seen as more of a trade, a necessary skill, but perhaps not quite as lofty as interpreting the humors or performing complex surgeries not related to the jaw. Their societal standing could vary wildly depending on their personal skill, their clientele, and the general appreciation for oral health in that particular culture, which, let's be honest, wasn't always a top priority when plagues and famines were regular visitors. You open your mouth, a universal gesture of dental vulnerability. The practitioner leans in, their breath perhaps smelling of garlic or wine from their midday meal. No minty fresh toothpaste for them, or for you, for that matter. Their examination is direct, likely involving a pointed instrument, perhaps made of bronze or sharpened bone, to probe the offending area. You try to relax, but every nerve in your body is a tightly wound spring. You see their tools laid out, perhaps on a piece of clean linen, a collection of probes, small scrapers, and the rather ominous-looking forceps or extractors. These wouldn't look out of place in a medieval toolkit. And indeed, some designs remained remarkably unchanged for centuries. Their perceived skill level is, of course, a mixed bag from your modern perspective. Some were undoubtedly highly skilled, capable of lancing abscesses with precision, attempting rudimentary fillings with resin or powdered stone, or even creating surprisingly sophisticated dental prosthetics, like those gold-banded false teeth found in Etruscan tombs. They might have understood the importance of hygiene, at least in a basic sense, recommending mouthwashes made from herbs or wine. They could offer genuine relief from agonizing pain, which, spoiler alert, often involved just yanking the offender out with a charmingly rustic pair of bronze pliers. Anesthesia. Bless your heart. Maybe a strong swig of wine if you were lucky, or a good, solid prayer. The concept of pain management was, shall we say, still in its beta phase. Then there were the treatments based more on superstition or incomplete understanding. Some of those ancient medical papyri we touched on earlier, like the Aber's papyrus, get wonderfully specific and a little bit unsettling with their dental advice. Imagine your dentist today suggesting a poultice of incense, onion, and, wait for it, parts of a mouse to soothe an abscess. Gourmet. Or perhaps they'd chant incantations to drive out the infamous toothworm. A concept so delightfully squirmy it almost makes you nostalgic for the days before we knew about boring old bacteria. This little critter was widely believed to be the cause of cavities and toothaches, gnawing away unseen. So, a skilled physician of the tooth might also be a skilled storyteller, convincingly explaining the worm's nefarious activities before heroically and perhaps painfully evicting it. The patient-practitioner interaction is one of trust, or perhaps desperation on your part. You're relying on their experience, their reputation. You might have heard of them through word of mouth, no pun intended. Perhaps a neighbor whose agonizing toothache they'd cured, or a noble whose smile they'd somehow preserved. You communicate your symptoms, probably through a series of groans, winces, and pointed fingers, and they listen, or at least appear to, before deciding on a course of action. There's not much in the way of informed consent. You're pretty much at their mercy, hoping their hands are steady and their diagnosis is more mouse-free than mouse-filled. And so, you find that historians still argue whether these early practitioners of dental arts were truly a separate, defined profession, complete with their own training pathways, and perhaps even secretive trade guilds, or if they were more like general physicians who just happened to be particularly good at, or perhaps just particularly willing to poke around in people's mouths. Were they dedicated specialists from the get-go? Or did they branch out after mastering broader medical knowledge? The lines were often blurry, especially in smaller communities where one versatile healer might have to do it all. As your hypothetical appointment concludes, perhaps with a tooth lighter and a pouch of coins significantly lighter too, you step back out into the slightly too bright sunlight. Your jaw is tender, throbbing with a new, post-procedure kind of ache. But hopefully, the original, relentless pain is starting to recede. You might feel a sense of relief, gratitude, or perhaps a lingering suspicion that a tiny piece of mouse is now part of your gum line. Either way, you've just had an intimate encounter with an ancient physician of the tooth, a figure both respected and feared, a purveyor of relief and, occasionally, some rather peculiar remedies. You walk away, vowing to be much, much more careful with those honeycakes in the future. Man indeed. And so, with that life-giving grain, a constant across the land, you might think you're set for a hearty, wholesome meal. You picture a warm loaf, fresh from a clay oven, the aroma filling your small mud brick home. It's the staff of life, isn't it? The foundation of so many meals, the very backbone of your ancient Egyptian diet, like we mentioned earlier with those essential crops. But as you take that first bite, there's something else, a little crunch, an unwelcome texture, and that, my friend, is where our story takes a slightly more abrasive turn. You see, the secret ingredient in almost every loaf of ancient Egyptian bread, the one they didn't list on the papyrus scroll, was sand. Lots and lots of sand. Not exactly the whole grain goodness you were hoping for. Is it? This wasn't just a stray speck here and there, mind you. We're talking a consistent, tooth-grinding, enamel-eroding presence. The very earth of Egypt, the desert that surrounded their fertile strip along the Nile, seemed determined to become part of their daily diet. An uninvited guest at every single meal. Now, imagine your own teeth for a moment. You brush. You floss well. Hopefully. You visit the nice person in the white coat if things get a bit dicey. The ancient Egyptians didn't have quite that level of preventative care or intervention. So, this constant, gritty assault took a heavy toll. Picture your teeth, day after day, meal after meal, grinding against these tiny hard particles of silica and feldspar. It's like using your molars as a very slow piece of sandpaper. The enamel, that hard protective outer layer, would wear down. Slowly at first, then with increasing, almost alarming speed as the years went by. You'd start to see the dentin, the softer, yellowish layer beneath, becoming exposed. This isn't just a cosmetic issue, a matter of a less than pearly smile. It's a gateway to a whole universe of dental ouch. We're talking sensitivity to hot and cold, then a dull ache, then sharp, shooting pain as bacteria, ever opportunistic, found their way into the delicate pulp chamber at the heart of your tooth. Abscesses were common, those throbbing, pus-filled infections at the root of the tooth, sometimes swelling your cheek to an alarming size, and occasionally even leading to dangerous bone loss in the jaw. Not exactly the serene, smiling visages you often see depicted in tomb paintings. Is it, in fact? It's a mainstream historical fact that the teeth of ancient Egyptian mummies show extreme abrasive wear, often worn down almost to the gum line, especially in older individuals. Paleopathologists, the wonderfully clever folks who study ancient diseases by examining human remains, can practically tell an ancient Egyptian's approximate age, and sometimes even glean clues about their social status just by looking at the degree of dental attrition. The wealthier might have had access to slightly better sifted flour, perhaps, but no one entirely escaped the grit. It's like a gritty timeline etched into their very being. A story told not in hieroglyphs, but in flattened cusps and exposed roots. You can almost hear the collective, historical wince echoing across the millennia. So, where did all this unwelcome crunch, this involuntary seasoning, actually come from? Well, it started right from the moment the grain was harvested from the fields. Picture the scene: vast, golden fields of emmer wheat or barley, those staples that formed the bedrock of their calorific intake. Once harvested by hand with sickles, the grain needed to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the inedible chaff and stalks. You might see workers energetically beating the cut stalks with wooden flails, or perhaps oxen, patient and plodding, treading over the grain spread out on a hard-packed earthen threshing floor. Now, these threshing floors weren't exactly the pristine, hygienically sealed environments of a modern food processing plant. You understand, they were often just cleared patches of earth, swept relatively clean, but still, earth, dust, fine soil, and yes, ubiquitous sand would inevitably get mixed in with the precious grain, especially if a playful gust of desert wind decided to join the agricultural party. And in a landscape dominated by the Sahara, wind carrying fine particles is a pretty constant companion. Then came the winnowing process. After threshing, you'd gather up the mixture of grain and chaff. Workers, often women, would use wide, shallow baskets or wooden scoops to toss the threshed grain into the air. The idea was simple and effective. You'd rely on that same breeze, or even just the natural fall, to carry away the lighter chaff, while the heavier, more valuable grain fell back down onto a mat or into a waiting basket. It's an ingenious, low-tech solution, but again, more opportunity for airborne sand and dust, swirling around from the nearby desert or the ground itself, to settle in and become intimately acquainted with your future lunch. Each grain essentially got a fine coating of the landscape, but the real villain in this dental drama, the primary source of all that tooth-destroying grit, was the milling process itself. Forget your modern, high-tech steel roller mills that produce flour finer than powdered sugar. We're going decidedly old school here. Back to basics. The ancient Egyptians ground their grain by hand, a laborious, physically demanding, daily task, typically performed by the women of the household. They used what's known as a saddle quern, a slightly concave, stationary lower stone, often made of fairly coarse rock, and a smaller, loaf-shaped or cylindrical upper stone that you'd have to rub back and forth, or sometimes in a rotary motion in later periods, across the grain to crush it into flour. You can almost feel the rhythmic strain in your shoulders and back, the perspiration, the fine dust rising into the hot air, the constant, monotonous scrape, Scrape. Scrape of stone on stone, hour after hour. It's no wonder they might have called it the daily grind. They just meant it a bit more literally than we do. It was hard, repetitive work, often done for several hours each and every day to produce enough flour for the family's bread. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit for you that really adds another layer of texture. So to speak, the type of stone used for these querns made a significant difference to the crunch factor in your bread. Often, these grinding stones, both the saddle and the handstone, were fashioned from local sandstone or limestone. These are relatively soft stones, geologically speaking, as you can imagine. While you're grinding the grain between these two surfaces, you're also grinding the stones themselves, ever so slightly, but relentlessly. Tiny particles of the quernstone, more sand, essentially, or stone dust, would break off and mix right into the flour. So, you weren't just getting environmental sand that blew in from the desert. You were getting stone ground. Stone, if they used harder stones, like the basalt, which they sometimes did, especially for what you might consider more premium grinding. If such a concept applied to grit, the amount of stone particle contamination might be less. Basalt is much tougher, but the salt wasn't always locally available. It often had to be imported from specific regions, making it more expensive and less common for everyday household use. So, for your average person, it was probably sandstone grit surprise in every mouthful. Some loaves of bread probably had more mineral content from the grinding stones than actual nutrients from the grain. One has to wonder if any opportunistic ancient Egyptian market vendor ever tried to sell it as new, improved, fortified with essential minerals from the very heart of the sacred land. That's joke number one for you. The resulting flour wouldn't be the fine, silky, uniform powder you casually scoop from a paper bag today. It would be coarse, uneven, and, as we've established, liberally seasoned with sand and stone dust. This gritty flour was then mixed with water, maybe a little sourdough starter cultured from wild yeasts if you were lucky, or just yesterday's dough, kneaded into various shapes, and baked. Baking often took place in simple, beehive-shaped clay ovens, or sometimes even directly in the hot ashes of a fire, which, you guessed it, could add its own little sprinkle of ash and char. The baking process, of course, wouldn't magically remove the sand. It just baked it right in, locking it permanently into the structure of the bread. Every bite was a little geological adventure for your enamel. Think about that sensation when you accidentally bite down on a tiny piece of eggshell in your scramble, or an unspotted stone in a poorly washed bag of lentils. That sudden, jarring, unpleasant crunch. Now, imagine that sensation, but more subtle, more pervasive, present in almost every mouthful of your staple food, every single day of your life, from childhood to old age. It's no wonder their teeth wore down so dramatically. We complain if our fancy artisanal sourdough bread is a bit too crusty for our liking. They were dealing with actual geology in their daily ciabatta. Maybe this is why ancient Egyptian dentists, yes, they did have individuals who specialized in teeth, though their skills were somewhat rudimentary by our standards, seem to have focused a lot on pain relief, spells, and extraction. There wasn't much you could do to repair that kind of relentless, cumulative damage, not with the tools and dental knowledge they possessed. No tiny high-speed drills, no composite fillings, no reassuring hygienist in a colorful smock telling you to floss more effectively. Just a lot of stoic suffering, probably, and maybe some interesting herbal poultices packed around an aching tooth, which likely tasted better than the bread. At least, there's joke number 2, a little nod to primitive dentistry versus our modern complaints. This brings us to a point of gentle, ongoing contention among scholars, a question that sparks quiet debate in university halls. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians truly understood the direct link between their gritty diet, particularly the sand-laden bread, and the rampant dental problems they so clearly experienced. Did they connect the dots between the sandy flour from their cornstones and the aching jaws and visibly worn-down teeth? Or did they just accept dental afflictions, the pain, the infections, the eventual tooth loss, as an inevitable and unfortunate part of life? Like gray hair or the occasional bad flood from the Nile, they were incredibly astute observers of the human body in many other ways, developing surprisingly sophisticated medical treatments for various ailments. Remember, their knowledge of anatomy, gleaned in part from the practice of mummification, was considerable for the time. They could set bones. They performed some types of surgeries, and their papyri list remedies for all sorts of conditions. Yet, the evidence for advanced dental treatment beyond extraction, draining abscesses, or perhaps trying to stabilize loose teeth with gold wire in very rare, elite cases is surprisingly sparse. Perhaps the problem was so universal, so normal across the entire population, that it didn't register as something that could be fixed by altering food preparation methods. Or maybe they did know, on some level. But what was the practical alternative? Stop eating bread. In a society where bread was quite literally life, the primary source of calories for most people, that wasn't really an option. You can't exactly tell your family, "Sorry kids, no bread tonight. The rocks in the flour are a bit too rocky today." That probably wouldn't fly for very long. And that's our third little joke, playing on the idea of choice. So, as you picture that ancient Egyptian family gathering for their evening meal, perhaps by the flickering light of an oil lamp, remember that the simple, fundamental act of eating their daily bread was also a slow, inexorable process of wearing down their very teeth. It's a stark, rather uncomfortable reminder that even the most basic aspects of life, the things we often take for granted like a soft sandwich loaf, could be fraught with hidden, daily challenges in the ancient world. That staff of life they relied upon had a seriously sandy, gritty core. It really does give a whole new meaning to the phrase, tough to chew, doesn't it? Okay, so you've now got a pretty good picture of those ancient Egyptian mouths constantly battling the relentless grit, like we talked about. That invisible sandpaper in every bite of bread, every sip of water. Your own teeth might be feeling a little sensitive just thinking about it, but the desert wasn't the only adversary waging war on their dental well-being. Oh no, it turns out, even beyond the grits, there were other dietary woes, some of them deceptively sweet. You see, while sand was busy grinding teeth down, creating those flat surfaces, and sometimes exposing the poor, screaming pulp, other elements in their diet were launching a different kind of attack, a more insidious, sugary siege. Think about the foods that were prized, the treats, the daily staples, high on that list. Dates, glorious and sticky, tooth-achingly sweet dates. They grew abundantly along the Nile, a readily available source of energy. And honey, golden and viscous, was the ancient world's ultimate sweetener, used in everything from medicines to religious offerings to just making things taste a whole lot better. You can almost feel that thick, cloying sweetness coating your own teeth. Can't you? That lingering sugary film. For the ancient Egyptians, these weren't just occasional indulgences. For many, especially dates, they were a significant part of their caloric intake. So much for natural sugars being inherently angelic. That constant exposure to sticky sugars provided a veritable feast for the bacteria that cause tooth decay. And then, there were the drinks. Water, of course, was essential, though often carrying its own gritty payload, as we've established. But beer was a cornerstone of the Egyptian diet. For everyone from the pyramid builders to the priests, it was nutritious, a source of calories, and generally safer to drink than untreated river water. Wine, while perhaps more common among the well-to-do, was also part of the picture. Now, these fermented beverages, particularly the sweeter, less refined beers of the time, also contained sugars and, crucially, were acidic. So, you're not just getting a sugar hit, but you're also bathing your teeth in an acidic environment that can soften enamel, making it even more vulnerable. Imagine that a gritty breakfast, followed by a sugary, acidic beer chaser. Your modern dentist would probably just hand you a set of dentures on your first visit if you described that daily routine. It's a wonder anyone had any teeth left by 30. Maybe that's why they built the pyramids with such precision. They were trying to work off the beer carbs and the impending toothaches. This leads us to the different kinds of dental destruction these diets caused. The abrasion from sand. Remember that? Was like taking a file to the teeth. It wore down the cusps, flattened the chewing surfaces, and could eventually lead to the pulp chamber being exposed, causing excruciating pain and infection. You'd feel that as a constant, grinding wear, a sensitivity that grows over years. But the problems from sugars, like those in dates, honey, and beer, were different. These fostered the growth of specific bacteria that produce acids as a byproduct of metabolizing those sugars. These acids then dissolve the enamel, creating tiny holes that grow into larger cavities, or caries, as your dentist calls them. This is a more targeted attack, a chemical erosion, rather than a mechanical one. You might experience this as a sharp pang when eating something sweet, or a dull ache as the decay gets closer to the nerve. So, you had this unfortunate two-pronged assault, physical grinding. From grit and chemical decay from sugars and acids, a real dental double whammy. Now, if you're thinking, surely cavities are a modern problem, fueled by our processed foods and sugary sodas? Well, think again. It's a mainstream historical fact that cavities have been found in numerous ancient Egyptian mummies. When researchers carefully unwrap and examine these ancient individuals, they often find teeth riddled with decay, not just wear. This isn't some new discovery. It's been observed for decades, painting a clear picture of the dental suffering that was quite common. Some of these mummies show evidence of abscesses, infections that spread from decayed teeth into the jawbone, which must have been agonizing. There were no root canals back then, no sophisticated fillings. Extraction, probably with fairly brutal tools, was often the only cure. And here's a quirky tidbit for you, something that really brings their diet to life, quite literally on their teeth. Sometimes, when dental anthropologists are examining ancient teeth under powerful microscopes, looking at the calculus, that's hardened plaque, by the way, the stuff your hygienist scrapes off. They find microscopic food residues trapped within it. It's like a time capsule of meals past. They've identified tiny fibers from dates, fragments of fig seeds, and even minuscule bits of other plant materials. It's the ancient equivalent of finding a poppy seed from this morning's bagel stuck in your teeth. Only these remnants have been there for millennia. It's a direct, almost personal link to what someone was eating thousands of years ago. Imagine your dentist leaning in and saying, looks like a bit of 1500 BC fig in there. Tutankhamun, been flossing with papyrus again. Probably not. But it's a fun thought, isn't it? These micro-remains help confirm the types of sticky crepe, carbohydrate-rich foods that were contributing to that decay. Of course, the extent to which these sugary culprits permeated society is a point of discussion. Historians still argue whether the consumption of honey, and perhaps more exotic sweetened foods, was widespread across all social strata, or if it was more of a privilege of the elite. Dates were common, certainly, but was the really concentrated, decay-inducing sweetness of honey a daily treat for a farmer tilling the fields? Or more of a special occasion indulgence, if available at all the elite, with greater access to varied and richer foods, including more honey and perhaps even sweetened wine, might have suffered disproportionately from certain types of decay, while the general populace got the double hit of grit and readily available fermentable carbohydrates like dates and rough beer. It's a complex picture. And the teeth themselves, with their silent stories of wear and decay, provide some of our best clues. You can almost hear the collective groan of a nation dealing with toothaches, a sound lost to time but easily imagined. The next time you enjoy a sweet treat, maybe spare a thought for those ancient Egyptians who paid a high price for their sugary pleasures. Without the benefit of a good toothbrush or a friendly neighborhood dentist, their sweet life often came with a distinctly bitter, dental aftertaste. Now, let's drift a little deeper into a particularly unpleasant corner of this ancient dental landscape. You feel a familiar dull throb starting deep within your jaw, perhaps near one of those teeth we talked about earlier, the ones worn down by grit and tough foods. At first, it's just an annoying guest, a background hum of discomfort you try to ignore. You've got things to do after all. That patch of wild grain isn't going to harvest itself, and the children need watching. But this isn't like the fleeting sensitivity you've experienced before. This ache, it lingers. It has persistence. It has ambition. Over the next few days, you feel it grow, like a malevolent seed sprouting in the bone. The throb intensifies, becoming a pulsing, rhythmic beat that syncs with your own terrified heart. Sleep becomes a distant memory, a luxury you can no longer afford. Every beat of your pulse sends a fresh wave of fire through your jaw, up into your temple, down into your neck. You try to chew on the other side of your mouth, but even the slightest movement sends daggers of pain shooting through you. Soon, even soft foods are out of the question. Your cheek, once unremarkable, begins to swell. It starts subtly, a little puffiness you might try to hide, but it's relentless. It grows taut, hot to the touch, and a disfiguring redness spreads across your skin. You catch your reflection in a still pool of water and barely recognize the distorted, agonized face staring back. It's like an unwelcome tenant has moved into your jaw and decided to do some aggressive, unsolicited redecorating. This, my friend, is the agony of a dental abscess, a pocket of infection brewing at the root of a tooth or in the gums beside it. It's one of the most common and truly debilitating afflictions you could face in the ancient world. A world with no antibiotics, no sterile surgical tools, no understanding of germ theory. The suffering is immense. You're not just dealing with pain, you're battling fever, chills, and a profound, bone-deep weariness as your body tries, often in vain, to fight off the invasion. The infection can spread, sometimes with terrifying speed. Your airway might feel tight. Swallowing can become an ordeal. And the fear, a constant companion. Whispers of even worse outcomes. Remember those early human ancestors and their struggles for survival. An abscess could take down the strongest hunter, the most skilled gatherer, rendering them helpless. So, what are your options? Well, they're limited. And by limited, I mean practically non-existent by our modern standards. You might try rinsing your mouth with cool water, or perhaps a concoction of bitter herbs someone in your group vaguely remembers their grandmother using. Poultices are popular. A mash of leaves, maybe some mud, applied to the outside of your swollen cheek in a desperate attempt to draw out the evil. You might press a heated stone against the swelling, hoping the warmth will bring some relief, or perhaps, paradoxically, a cold one to numb the fire. The community healer, if your group is lucky enough to have one, might murmur incantations, wave smoking branches, or perform rituals designed to appease whatever spirit they believe is causing your torment. It's a bit like trying to put out a house fire with a teacup. Well-intentioned, perhaps, but ultimately optimistic. The sheer prevalence of this misery is most starkly evident when you look at the past. It's a rather grim, mainstream historical fact that skeletal remains from ancient populations show an incredibly high frequency of dental abscesses. Archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, when they gently unearth those ancient jawbones, often find the telltale signs: holes eroded into the bone at the tips of tooth roots, evidence of where these infections raged, sometimes even breaking through the bone to drain. It's a silent testament to centuries of silent screams. Imagine looking at a skull that's thousands of years old and seeing, clear as day, the damage wrought by the same kind of infection that might send us scurrying to the dentist for a root canal and a course of amoxicillin. It really puts your own minor dental grumbles into perspective, doesn't it? Now, amidst all this suffering, ancient peoples weren't entirely without their own folk remedies, some of which might even raise an eyebrow or a hopeful smile today. Here's a quirky tidbit. For you, there's some evidence, or at least strong folklore, suggesting the use of things like garlic or onion to combat infections. You can almost picture someone, desperate with pain, being told to chew on a clove of raw garlic or hold a slice of onion against the offending gum. Given what we now know about the antimicrobial properties of allicin in garlic, perhaps there was a sliver of efficacy there. Of course, the primary effect might have been that your breath became so potent it scared the infection into submission, or at least made your companions keep a respectful distance, giving you some much-needed personal space. Stay back. Igor, this toothache is a one-man show, and my breath is its co-star. When the swelling became truly alarming, when the pressure was unbearable, sometimes a bolder, or perhaps more desperate, approach was taken. Attempts might have been made to lance the abscess, to pierce the swollen gum or cheek to release the pus. Imagine the scene: a sharpened piece of flint, a pointed bone, or perhaps a heated metal sliver. If your culture was in the Bronze or Iron Age, no anesthetic, no sterilization, just grit and a prayer. And this brings us to a point of ongoing discussion among those who study these ancient practices. Historians still argue whether these ancient attempts to drain or manage abscesses, often performed with rudimentary and unhygienic tools, actually improved the patient's chances of survival, or if they inadvertently introduced new, more aggressive infections, turning a bad situation into a fatal one. Did that courageous or foolhardy incision bring blessed relief and a turning point towards healing? Or did it simply open a new gateway for a host of opportunistic bacteria to join the already raging party in your jaw? It's a sobering thought, the fine line between a desperate remedy and a death sentence. The throbbing continues, a relentless drumbeat marking the slow passage of agonizing hours. You might feel the tooth itself loosening in its socket, the infection eating away at the structures that hold it firm. Sometimes, in a grim parody of treatment, the tooth might eventually fall out on its own, bringing with it a gush of foul-tasting pus, and, if you're incredibly lucky, a decrease in pressure and the beginning of a slow, painful recovery. More often, though, the infection would just find new territories to conquer. The simple, grinding wear on teeth, which we touched upon earlier, created pathways for bacteria, turning an everyday consequence of their diet into a potential prelude to this agonizing ordeal. You lie there, helpless, hoping for a miracle, or at least for the pain to just stop. Right. So, now that we've peeked into the minds and remedies of these ancient dental practitioners, let's get a bit more tactile. Shall we? You're now stepping into the, dare I say, operating room. Though that's probably a generous term. Think less gleaming steel and more rustic charm. We're about to explore the actual instruments believed to have been used by Egyptian dentists. The real tools of the trade, their probes, and perhaps even very early forms of forceps. Imagine, if you will, the dentist's toolkit. It's not going to be a vast, intimidating array like your modern dentist unrolls with a dramatic flourish. Oh no, we're talking a more curated, minimalist collection. You see, based on archaeological finds and those intriguing, though sometimes frustratingly vague, tomb depictions, the instruments were quite basic. Let's start with the probe. You can almost feel one in your hand now, can't you? Picture a slender rod, perhaps no thicker than a modern knitting needle, but likely shorter. It might be crafted from bronze, cool and a little heavy, with that characteristic greenish tinge it would acquire over millennia if buried. You'd see it tapering to a delicate point, or maybe it has a tiny, almost imperceptible hook, or a small, smooth, rounded end. Its purpose? Well, pretty much what you'd expect. This was the ancient Egyptian dentist's primary investigation tool. Remember how we discussed those papyri detailing treatments for loose teeth and gum ailments? Well, these are the gadgets they might have reached for to gently explore a throbbing tooth, to check the extent of a cavity, that toothworm doing its nefarious business, or to assess just how wobbly a tooth had become. You can imagine them, with a surprisingly steady hand, using this probe to poke very, very gently around the gum line, searching for those pockets of infection we touched upon earlier. Perhaps they'd use the tip to try and clear away a bit of debris, or even, in a moment of brave or desperate intervention, to help drain a painful abscess. It's a far cry from the ultrasonic scalers of today, but for its time, this simple probe was a critical diagnostic friend. It allowed for a tactile understanding of the problem, a way to see with their fingertips inside the dim recesses of the mouth. There wasn't much in the way of good lighting. Remember? So, that sense of touch, guided by the probe, would have been paramount. And here's a little something for you. Some of these tools might not have even been metal. Imagine a very carefully shaped and hardened wooden probe, perhaps from acacia or sycamore wood, polished smooth, or even one fashioned from a shard of flint or obsidian for exceptional sharpness. Though that might be more for lancing, bronze was definitely a go-to, giving that lovely greenish patina over time. But don't discount the ingenuity with other, more perishable materials which, sadly, wouldn't survive the ages for us to admire. It makes your modern electric toothbrush with 5 settings and Bluetooth connectivity seem like something out of a science fiction movie, doesn't it? Which, I suppose, to them, it would be. Now, let's move on to something a little more. Assertive forceps. The word itself conjures up images of tooth extraction. And yes, that was likely part of their function. But we need to adjust our expectations. You're not picturing those gleaming, terrifyingly efficient stainless steel forceps your dentist might use. Early Egyptian forceps, if they were indeed used for teeth, were probably far simpler, perhaps even cruder. Some archaeological finds include pincer-like instruments, often made of bronze. These might look like 2 flat pieces of metal, perhaps hinged, or even 2 separate pieces used in conjunction to grip. Their design suggests they wouldn't have offered a huge amount of leverage or a particularly firm grip for a deeply rooted molar. So, their function in dentistry. If they were used for extractions, it was almost certainly for teeth that were already very, very loose, teeth practically falling out on their own due to severe periodontal disease. Like we explored with all that sand in their bread causing wear and tear. You can picture the scene: the patient, already in considerable discomfort, and the practitioner, carefully maneuvering these rudimentary forceps to grasp the offending tooth and gently, oh so gently, ease it out. So, less open wide and say ah, and more. Hang on, is that thing even meant to come out? It wouldn't have been about brute force. The tools simply weren't designed for it, and the risk of fracturing the tooth or jaw would have been immense. Perhaps they were also used to remove fragments of already broken teeth. It's a well-documented fact that collections of medical instruments, including items that could have served dental purposes, have been found in physicians' tombs, suggesting they were valued possessions, perhaps even for use in the afterlife. These kits weren't extensive by our standards, often just a handful of tools, but their presence speaks volumes about the status of the practitioner and the perceived importance of their craft. You might find a few probes, a knife or two, which could also be for minor surgical procedures elsewhere on the body, and these ambiguous pincer-like tools. And this is where the picture gets a little hazy, a little more open to interpretation. Historians still argue whether some of the more ambiguous, tweezer-like tools found in these collections were truly for delicate dental work, like removing a tiny splinter of bone or a foreign object from between teeth, or if they were, say, for crafting intricate jewelry components, applying makeup, or perhaps for plucking particularly stubborn eyebrow hairs. The glamour of ancient Egypt knew no bounds. After all, and a multi-purpose tool is a sensible tool. The context of the find is key, but even then, without explicit instructions, an IKEA manual for ancient Egyptian forceps, if you will, their exact dental applications can be a matter of scholarly debate. The depictions we have from tomb walls and papyri are also not always crystal clear. While they show various medical procedures, specific dental operations with clear views of the tools in use are frustratingly rare. We often have to infer from the shape of the tool and its similarity to later, more identifiable instruments from other cultures, or by considering the types of dental problems we know they faced. So, when you see these tools in a museum display, or depicted in a book, remember that each one carries not just its physical form, but a cloud of informed guesswork and ongoing discussion about its precise role in easing the dental woes of ancient Egyptians. They were working with what they had, with ingenuity, and one hopes, a very gentle touch. These simple implements, the probes and the early forceps, represent the very beginnings of interventional dentistry. A far cry from the advanced procedures we know today, but a crucial first step on a very long road. You can almost hear the soft clink of bronze as the practitioner selects the right tool for the job. A quiet sound in a world filled with the much louder aches of daily life. And so, you find yourself settled, as much as one can settle, knowing what's likely coming next. Remember that charming array of tools we saw earlier? The ones that looked suspiciously like they'd been borrowed from a medieval armory. Well, now you're about to experience their purpose firsthand. The air around you, thick with the scent of, well, whatever passed for antiseptic back then, perhaps a bit of vinegar or a strongly brewed herb, doesn't exactly scream comfort. Your jaw is aching, a deep, throbbing pulse that's been your unwelcome companion for days, maybe weeks. And the biggest question looming in your mind, a question that probably dwarfs even the fear of the procedure itself, is what about the pain? You look towards the practitioner, their face a mixture of grave seriousness and, well, let's be honest, probably a bit of weary resignation. They've seen this fear countless times. But here's the kicker. The part that makes your modern sensibilities want to curl up and hide. There's no gentle hiss of nitrous oxide, no reassuring prick of a needle delivering blissful numbness. You're facing this, for the most part, raw. The sophisticated anesthetics you take for granted today. The local blocks that make a root canal feel like a slightly boring nap. the general anesthesia that lets you wake up wondering if it even happened, they are simply not part of this picture. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Like imagining a world without Wi-Fi, only significantly more ouch. Now, let's talk extractions. That troublesome molar, the one that's been staging a rebellion in your mouth, has got to go. Without effective pain relief, this is less a dental procedure and more a test of sheer human endurance. You might be given a swig of strong alcohol, something fiery to gulp down, partly to sterilize, partly to bolster your courage, and mostly, one suspects, to make you a bit less aware. But that's a flimsy shield against the sharp, immediate agony of a tooth being forcibly evicted from its long-term residence. You hear the scrape of metal against enamel, feel the immense pressure as the practitioner, using tools that, as we've established, prioritized function over finesse, begins their work. There's no gentle wiggle, no careful numbing. It's a direct, often brutal confrontation. You might grip the sides of the chair, your knuckles white. Your own breath catches in your throat. The practitioner, bless their cotton socks, is probably trying to be quick. Speed, in this context, is the closest thing to mercy. And here's a rather grim beat. Mainstream historical fact. For many of these early dental interventions, there's actually very limited evidence for truly effective, widespread pain relief. As we understand it, they tried things. Of course, poultices, strange concoctions of herbs, things pressed against the offending tooth. But when it came to the acute, invasive pain of an extraction or drilling, the options were starkly limited. Imagine knowing that the primary pain management strategy is just getting it over with as fast as possible. It certainly puts a new spin on the phrase, grin and bear it, doesn't it? Or perhaps, more accurately, grit your teeth and bear it, though that might be counterproductive in this specific scenario. Now, for a quirky tidbit. You've likely heard of substances like opium or mandrake root being used in other medical contexts throughout history for their pain-dulling or sedative properties. Opium, derived from the poppy, was a known analgesic, and mandrake, with its rather eerie human-shaped root, was steeped in folklore and used for its narcotic effects. So, the natural question is, did these find their way into the early dentist's toolkit? Well, yes and no. While these substances were certainly part of the broader pharmacopoeia, their application in dentistry for acute procedural pain is a bit more nebulous. Opium might have been used, perhaps as a tincture like laudanum, to take the edge off pre- or post-procedure, or even applied topically in some form. Mandrake, often associated with powerful, even dangerous soporific effects, might have been considered. But controlling its dosage would have been incredibly tricky, and its effectiveness for the sharp, localized pain of dental work is debatable. It's one thing to lull someone into a stupor for a lingering illness. It's another to reliably numb a specific tooth for extraction without, accidentally sending the patient on a one-way trip to dreamland. The side effects alone, from severe nausea to unpredictable levels of consciousness, would have made them a risky bet for routine dental work. Still, desperate times, desperate measures, and it's plausible that some practitioners experimented, especially if the patient was, shall we say, particularly vocal about their discomfort. One could almost imagine a patient thinking, honestly, a few days of opium-induced weird dreams sounds better than this tooth. This lack of reliable anesthesia leads us directly to a fascinating point of contention among those who study these things. Historians still argue whether practitioners relied more on psychological techniques or perhaps even the power of placebo to manage patient distress. Think about it. If you can't truly numb the pain, what's left? Perhaps it was the practitioner's demeanor, a calm, authoritative presence that exuded confidence, even if it was a bit of a performance. Maybe they employed distraction, engaging you in conversation, however strained, or encouraging you to focus on your breathing, on anything but the impending procedure. There's also the sheer power of expectation. If you're told a certain herbal rinse will dull the ache, and you desperately want it to, it just might, to a small degree. This isn't to diminish the very real suffering, but to acknowledge the complex interplay between mind and body, especially when physical relief is scarce. The bedside manner of the era might have been less about gentle empathy and more about a firm, almost commanding, presence designed to get you through it with minimal fuss, for both your sake and theirs. After all, a flailing patient doesn't make for an easy extraction. So, you're there, bracing yourself. The promise of relief from the toothache is a powerful motivator, but the path to that relief is, shall we say, unpaved and rather rocky. Your trust is placed entirely in the hands of this individual, hoping their skill outweighs the crudeness of their tools and the absence of any real chemical comfort. It's a testament to human resilience, really. The things people endured for the hope of a pain-free tomorrow. The thud of your own heart is probably the loudest thing in the room, save for the clink of metal instruments and the practitioner's low, steady instructions. You take a deep breath, or try to, and hope it's over quickly. Because quickly is the best kind of anesthetic you're likely to get. So, you've seen the rather enthusiastic tools our ancient Egyptian dentist might wield. Remember those pointy things we talked about? Yeah, good times. But it wasn't all about brute force and, well, more brute force. Now, you're stepping into their pharmacy, their apothecary, if you will. It's less gleaming steel and more earthy. You can almost smell it. A blend of pungent aromas, sticky substances, and a whole lot of faith. Forget your neat little blister packs of ibuprofen. We're going old school. Really old school. Back to where the Nile's bounty met the patient's cavity. And what's the star of this ancient Egyptian dental show? You guessed it. Or maybe you didn't. But it's honey. Golden. Viscous. And surprisingly effective. Even by our modern, slightly cynical standards. You see them reaching for a clay pot, the sides sticky with overflow, filled with this liquid gold. They knew, intuitively perhaps, what we now understand scientifically with all our fancy microscopes. Honey has some pretty impressive antibacterial properties. It's hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture out of wounds and, crucially, out of bacteria. Which isn't great news for those little critters trying to set up shop in your molar. So, you might see our ancient practitioner carefully daubing it directly onto an inflamed gum, a swollen patch of red in a landscape of discomfort. Or perhaps they're mixing it with other ingredients to form a thick, sweet paste, which is then meticulously packed into a painful, gaping cavity. Imagine that sticky sweetness. A stark, almost cloying contrast to the throbbing, sharp pain you might be feeling. It's a bit like when your grandma tells you to put honey on a burn or a scrape. Sometimes the old ways, born from centuries of trial and error, have a real kernel of truth, even if they didn't have the peer-reviewed studies and lab reports to back it up. They just knew it worked, or at least it seemed to. Next to the pots of honey, you'll find an array of dried herbs, bundled and hanging, or perhaps stored in woven baskets. The air here is thick with their complex scent, a mix of something like minty freshness from crushed leaves, and earthy bitterness from certain roots, and perhaps something a little floral, a little resinous. These aren't just for a nice pot of tea to calm the nerves, though I'm sure they enjoyed that too. Perhaps with a side of existential dread about their dental appointment. Many of these herbs were chosen for specific perceived properties. You might see willow bark, for instance, a humble-looking substance that's a natural source of salicylic acid. Yes, the precursor to aspirin. So, if you're nursing a particularly nasty, throbbing toothache, the kind that makes you want to bang your head against the nearest pyramid, a poultice made from crushed willow bark, moistened into a paste, might be applied to your jaw, or perhaps some mint. Not just for fresh breath, though that was probably a welcome bonus, especially after some of the other ingredients we'll get to, but for its cooling, soothing qualities on irritated gums, frankincense, and myrrh. Those famous resins, far more valuable than just their biblical cameos, were also big players in the ancient Egyptian medical kit, including for dental woes. Medical papyri, such as the famous Ebers Papyrus, which is one of our most important windows into their medical world, list specific dental recipes using ingredients like crushed dates, ground fava beans, and certainly frankincense to treat infections, reduce swelling, or soothe persistent pain. These weren't just chucked in whole. They were meticulously ground with a stone pestle against a heavy mortar, sometimes heated gently over a small flame to release their volatile compounds, and then applied as thick pastes, sticky packings for cavities, or even infused into liquids for rinses. You can almost hear the gentle, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of that pestle, a sound that meant relief, or at least the attempt at it, was on its way. It wasn't all plant-based goodness, though. Our Egyptian dental practitioners also delved into the mineral kingdom, scraping and grinding substances from the earth itself. You might see them using ochre, that rich, earthy red pigment we associate with their incredible tomb paintings. But it wasn't just for decorating the afterlife. It possibly served as an astringent in dental preparations, to help tighten gums that were receding, or to staunch bleeding after, say, a particularly enthusiastic extraction. Think of it as a very, very early version of those medicated mouthwashes that make your mouth feel a bit like a Saharan sand dune, all puckered and dry, but hopefully cleaner. Natron, that naturally occurring salt mixture we mentioned earlier, so crucial for the mummification process, also found its way into medical, and likely dental, applications as a cleansing agent. Perhaps a natron rinse, swished vigorously, to try and fizz away some of the less pleasant inhabitants of your mouth. It probably tasted memorable, and not in a good Michelin star, I must have this again kind of way. More like, wow, I really, really hope this works, because I don't ever want to taste that again memorable. Now, this is where things get a little, well, interesting, and you might need to suspend your disbelief, or at least your gag reflex, alongside the reasonably sensible honey and the potentially effective herbs. You might find some ingredients in their pharmacological arsenal that make you tilt your head and go, huh, are you absolutely sure about that end? Some prescriptions for toothache, meticulously copied by scribes onto papyrus, bafflingly included ingredients like a crushed mouse. Yes, the whole thing, probably tail and all, or specific parts of less common animals, perhaps even powdered bat, which were likely included more for their symbolic oomph or a bit of sympathetic magic than any actual, discernible medicinal benefit. Imagine the scene. Oh, your molar is giving you GIP. Have you tried our special mouse paste? It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if sometimes the cure was designed to be so unappealing that the disease just gave up and left out of sheer terror. Or perhaps the sheer shock and horror of the ingredients simply distracted you from the pain. A bit like when someone tells you a truly, catastrophically awful joke. You forget your troubles for a crucial second just to process the sheer audacity of it all. Did he really just say mouse paste? You'd wonder. And then, of course, there are the incantations. Because, naturally, No ancient remedy is truly complete without a little bit of magical reinforcement, a spiritual cherry on top of the medicinal mud pie. While the dentist is carefully packing your protesting tooth with a mixture of honey, figs, crushed sycamore bark, and maybe something less identifiable that you're trying very hard not to think about, a priest or a magician might be chanting nearby. They'd be invoking powerful deities like Horus, the falcon-headed god of healing, or Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of plagues and healing, a bit of a paradox. Her, but you didn't argue to drive out the dreaded toothworm, that pesky little demon they often believed gnawed away at your teeth from the inside. It's a truly holistic approach. You see, body, mind, and demonic pests, every angle covered. So, you're sitting there, probably on a low stool, mouth agape, full of a concoction that smells vaguely of honey, herbs, desert dust, and perhaps a hint of something you'd rather not identify, listening to some soothing, or perhaps not so soothing, chanting. Did it all work? That's the million sestertii question, isn't it? The big one. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of many of these ancient dental concoctions were due to actual active ingredients within the herbs and minerals. A powerful placebo effect amplified by the solemn ritual and the undeniable authority of the healer, or simply the body's own natural healing processes kicking in despite, or maybe even in spite of, the help it was receiving. Honey, as we've discussed, likely did offer genuine antibacterial action. Some herbs, like willow, contained compounds that had real analgesic properties, but for many of the more elaborate, or, shall we say, exotic ingredients, the jury is still very much out, deliberating somewhere in the dusty archives of time. It's easy for us, with our modern scientific understanding, our double-blind studies, and our obsession with evidence-based medicine, to scoff or to find it all a bit quaint. But for someone in agonizing pain, with limited options, living in a world suffused with magic and divine intervention, even the hope offered by these treatments, however strange they seem to us now, must have been a powerful balm in itself. You can almost picture the scene, the patient, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and trepidation, as the dentist solemnly explains the virtues of powdered gazelle hoof mixed with fermented barley water. It's an acquired taste, he might say, with a knowing, reassuring wink. Probably not, but it's fun to imagine the bedside manner. It's a bit like some modern wellness trends, isn't it? The more obscure and slightly unpleasant sounding the ingredient, the more miraculous its purported benefits. Oh, you haven't tried the volcanic ash and fermented yak butter smoothie? Darling, you're missing out. It cures everything from bad hair days to existential angst. Think about the textures these ancient patients experienced, the pervasive stickiness of honey, the unavoidable grittiness of ground minerals that never quite dissolved, the fibrous nature of herbs packed deep into a painful cavity, and the tastes overwhelmingly sweet from the honey, then bitter from certain herbs, perhaps salty from natron, or even unpleasantly metallic from some mineral compounds, and the smells, a complex, almost overwhelming perfume of the ancient world, sacred incense mingling with the scent of decay, medicinal plants fighting for olfactory dominance with the ever-present dust of Egypt. These weren't just random assortments thrown together in a panic. They were often carefully prepared according to recipes passed down through generations, recorded on precious papyri that were worth more than their weight in gold. Each ingredient, in their worldview, had a purpose, even if that purpose sometimes leaned more towards the magical or symbolic than the strictly medical as we understand it. It's a universe away from the sterile, minty fresh, almost anonymous experience of a modern dental visit. But it was their cutting edge, their best shot at relief in a world full of aches. And you have to wonder, if you complained that the mousetail poultice wasn't quite doing the trick? Did they just suggest a bigger mouse next time? This one, madam, is a chief mouse. Much more potent, guaranteed. Probably not, but these ancient healers were certainly resourceful. Blending empirical observation with deep-seated tradition, they were working with the knowledge they had, combining observation of what seemed to work, tradition passed down from master to apprentice, and a healthy, understandable dose of what we might call hopeful thinking. The aim, after all, was always the same as it is today: to alleviate suffering, to mend what was broken, and to heal, even if their pharmacy looked a bit more like a witch's pantry or a medieval alchemist's lab to our somewhat spoiled modern eyes. All right, so after all that talk of poultices and potions, sometimes things just go a bit pear-shaped, don't they? Remember how we touched upon those everyday aches and pains? Those nagging little discomforts that people just had to live with now. Imagine one of those discomforts escalating, becoming an all-consuming agony. We're venturing into the realm of what you might loosely term surgery. Though perhaps controlled assault is a more fitting description for our specific focus tonight. The grand, time-honored tradition of yanking out a troublesome tooth. This, my friends, is the brutal art of extraction. Picture this: you've got a tooth. Not just any tooth, but that tooth. The one that started as a dull throb, a minor protest, when you bit down on something a bit too hard, like that slightly undercooked bit of, well, whatever vaguely edible thing was on the menu. But now, now it's a raging inferno in your jaw. It pulses with a life of its own, a malevolent beat that syncs up with your increasingly desperate heart rate. Sleep a distant memory, eating a cruel joke. Your cheek is swollen, tender to the touch, radiating heat like a miniature forge. You can feel the pressure building, a deep, insistent agony that makes you want to claw at your own face. This isn't just a toothache anymore. This is a siege. The tooth is beyond saving, beyond any herbal rinse or carefully placed clove. It's become a source of poison, a festering enemy within, and it simply has to go. So, who do you turn to? There's no gleaming, sterile dental office with a friendly hygienist offering you a choice of fluoride flavors. No, you're looking for someone with strong hands and stronger nerves. This might be the local barber, who, as we've alluded to before, often doubled as a surgeon, a barber surgeon, a title that just screams competence, doesn't it? Or perhaps it's the village blacksmith, accustomed to wrestling with unyielding metal, a tooth being just a smaller, more organic challenge. Maybe it's a local healer, someone known for their poultices, but also for their grim determination when things get serious. They probably don't have a plaque on the wall saying, "Painless extractions guaranteed." Because, let's be honest, that would be false advertising on a monumental scale. Your ancient dentist might not have had a fancy reclining chair, but they certainly had enthusiasm and a very firm grip. Let's talk tools. Forget those slender, precisely engineered instruments of modern dentistry. You're more likely to see something that looks like it belongs in a toolbox, or perhaps a torture chamber, depending on your perspective. The star of the show is often a formidable-looking pair of forceps, probably iron, chunky, and utilitarian. Think of them as pliers, but for your mouth. Their primary goal to grip that offending tooth with unshakable resolve. Then there might be elevators, not the kind that take you to the top floor, but rather sharp, thin, and strong levers designed to be wedged between the tooth and the bone, to loosen its stubborn hold, to break the periodontal ligaments that are, at this point, your sworn enemies. If the tooth is particularly impacted or rotten, it might shatter under pressure. In that delightful scenario, Out might come a small chisel and a mallet to carefully or not so carefully chip away at the remaining fragments. It's all very visceral. Now, you're seated, or more likely, held down. Maybe you've had a swig of something potent, some rough wine, or a herbal concoction meant to dull the senses. But let's be clear, nothing available is going to truly touch the searing, sharp pain of what's about to happen. The surgeon approaches. You can smell the sweat, the iron of the tools, maybe even the lingering scent of their last patient. They peer into your mouth, perhaps with a grunt of professional assessment, or maybe just a sigh that says, "All right, let's get this over with." The cold metal touches your gum, then the tooth. There's a sickening pressure as the forceps try to find purchase. Your jaw creaks. The pain, which was already a 10, somehow finds an 11, then a 12. It's a white-hot, blinding agony that consumes every thought. You hear grunts, yours, the extractors. There's a rocking motion, a pulling, a twisting. Your head is braced, maybe by a couple of very large, unsmiling assistants. If you're lucky, the tooth comes out in one go. A horrid, sucking pop, followed by an immediate gush of blood and a strange, hollow relief mixed with the overwhelming pain. If you're unlucky, the crown snaps. That's when the real fun begins. The digging, the leveraging, the awful splintering sounds from inside your own head. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the extraction part referred more to extracting a confession than a molar. The aftermath isn't pretty. You're left with a bleeding, throbbing crater in your jaw. The relief from the pressure is immense, but it's quickly replaced by the raw, surgical pain of the wound. Infection is a huge risk, of course. Maybe they'll stuff the socket with some herbs known for their antiseptic properties, or have you rinse with a bitter brew. For aftercare, you might get a pat on the back and a suggestion to try not to scream too loudly. You'll scare the chickens. It sounds nightmarish, and it undoubtedly was. Yet, people endured it. Archaeologists frequently find skulls from ancient Egypt or medieval Europe showing evidence of tooth loss, sometimes with signs of healing sockets, suggesting successful if brutal extractions. So, it happened. And sometimes, people even survived and healed, carrying the gap as a testament to their ordeal. Now, for a slightly less terrifying, though equally desperate, image. Imagine a really stubborn, wobbly tooth, practically hanging by a thread, but still causing misery. A quirky tidbit from the annals of making do suggests that an extraction might have been performed with minimal tools. Perhaps a strong piece of animal sinew, or even a horsehair tied securely around the tooth. The other end could be tied to a doorknob, and then, well, you can imagine the sudden, if effective, removal method when the door is slammed shut. It's the kind of thing that makes you wince and chuckle nervously at the same time. Resourceful, in a terrifying sort of way. The frequency of such procedures is a point of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether such extractions were truly a desperate, last-ditch effort to save a life from raging infection, or if in some communities with individuals skilled, or at least willing to perform them, they became a more grimly accepted, if not common response to persistent toothache. Was it the absolute final option when death by sepsis seemed imminent, or did people ground down by weeks of agony eventually submit to the cure, knowing full well the torment it involved? It's a sobering thought, understanding that level of pain and the choices it forced upon people. Your options were limited: endure the unendurable, or submit to something that was, in itself, a different kind of unendurable. And so, the tooth puller, with their fearsome tools and iron will, remained a very necessary if dreaded figure in the landscape of ancient and medieval health. Duh. So, after seeing all those rather, shall we say, enthusiastic methods of yanking teeth out, you might be wondering if our ancient forebears ever thought about, you know, replacing them. Or perhaps even plugging up those pesky holes before they became extraction-worthy craters. It's a fair question. Did they just sigh, accept a gappy grin, and move on to a diet of soft bread and existential dread? Well, now we're tiptoeing into an area that's a bit murkier. Shall we say, a realm of whispers and what-ifs. The land of glimmers of prosthetics and fillings. You see, finding a neatly labeled ancient dentist's prosthetic kit, Model Alpha, is, unfortunately, not something archaeologists tend to stumble upon. The evidence for actual and functional tooth replacements or cavity fillings in the very distant past is incredibly sparse. Like finding a single, perfectly preserved chocolate chip in a vast desert of ancient sand. It's so limited. In fact, that every potential find sparks a fresh round of debate, a sort of academic pillow fight, but with more tweed jackets and fewer feathers. So, let's imagine, just for a moment, what these very early, very tentative attempts at dental DIY might have looked like if they truly existed as functional pieces for the living. If you were an ancient Egyptian, or perhaps an Etruscan noble with a missing front tooth, a real social catastrophe, even then, especially if you had a hot date by the Nile, what were your options? You're not just going to pop down to the local dental lab. Your prosthetic might be a rather creatively sourced replacement. Perhaps it's an animal tooth, maybe from a cow or a sheep, painstakingly carved to vaguely resemble its human counterpart. Or, and this is where it gets a little intimate, it could be another human tooth. Where did they get it? Let's just say recycling took on a whole new meaning, and we won't ponder too deeply on the previous owner's circumstances. These donor teeth, or even bits of ivory or specially shaped wood, wouldn't be screwed in with titanium posts. Of course, no. You're looking at something far more artisanal. Think delicate ligatures, thin threads, perhaps made from flax or even animal sinew, carefully wound around the neighboring, still sturdy teeth to hold the newcomer in place. Or, if you were really high status, you might see the glint of gold. Fine gold wires, soft and malleable, could be woven into an intricate little scaffold, a tiny golden cage gripping the false tooth and anchoring it to its neighbors. It sounds almost pretty, in a slightly macabre, ancient bling sort of way. Functionality. Probably not its strong suit. You wouldn't be crunching on hard nuts or tearing into tough roasted gazelle with your fancy new, but precariously wired in incisor. It was likely more for aesthetics, for restoring a semblance of a full smile, for keeping up appearances at those important chariot races or temple feasts. Chewing would have been a delicate, tentative affair, like trying to eat an apple with a tiara perched on your head. Possible, but you'd be very, very careful. Now, for your mainstream historical fact. There are indeed a few, very rare examples that get historians and archaeologists all hot and bothered. The Etruscans, those fascinating people from ancient Italy who predated the Romans, are particularly famous for this. Several Etruscan skulls, dating back to as early as 700 BCE, show rather elaborate dental appliances. These aren't just single teeth. Some are like rudimentary bridges, where gold bands or wires were used to hold together several teeth, including artificial ones made from animal bone or ivory, or even repurposed human teeth. One famous example from a tomb in Tarquinia shows a device with gold bands riveted together, designed to hold false teeth. It's quite sophisticated for its time, though again, whether it was worn in life with any degree of comfort or functionality, or if it was added post-mortem for the journey into the afterlife, is a point of contention. Similar, though perhaps less complex. Finds involving gold wire to stabilize loose teeth or bind replacements have also been noted in Phoenician and Egyptian contexts. It's tantalizing, isn't it? That glimmer of gold in an ancient jawbone, whispering of attempts to defy the inevitable decay? And what about fillings? If you've got a hole, the instinct is to plug it, right? Whether it's a hole in your roof or a hole in your molar. So, did they try? Again, the evidence is whisper thin. If you were to peer into an ancient cavity that someone tried to fill, what might you see? Forget your modern composite resins or amalgam. You might find a sticky, waxy substance packed in there. Beeswax is a candidate some researchers have proposed, based on a few incredibly rare finds, like a tooth from Slovenia dating back over 6,500 years that had a beeswax filling. Beeswax would have been readily available, malleable, and might have even offered a tiny bit of soothing property. Or perhaps they used tree resins, sticky saps that could harden and seal off the exposed nerve, at least temporarily. Maybe even a paste made of powdered stone mixed with some kind of binder. Or even, and here's our quirky tidbit for today, linen fibers. Yes, tiny threads of linen. You might think linen is for making breezy summer tunics or wrapping mummies, not for stuffing into your decaying bicuspid. But imagine, if you will, someone meticulously teasing apart linen threads and carefully packing them into a painful cavity. Why linen? Well, it's absorbent. It can be wadded up. And perhaps when soaked in some medicinal concoction, it might have provided a temporary barrier or even a way to hold a pain-relieving substance against the sore spot. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky pipe with an old sock. Not ideal. Probably not going to last. But in a moment of desperate, throbbing pain, you'd try almost anything, wouldn't you? Perhaps they hoped if it's good enough for Pharaoh's final nap, it's good enough for your aching tooth. This brings us squarely to the big, lingering question. The one that keeps dental anthropologists up at night, probably with a perfectly aligned, modern night guard in place. Historians still argue whether these few tantalizing examples represent true conscious attempts at restorative dentistry for the living, or if they are perhaps post-mortem additions, or even just bizarre flukes of preservation. The post-mortem theory is quite strong for some of these gold-wired teeth. Imagine a wealthy individual who lost teeth in life for their journey to the afterlife, where appearances might still matter. Their attendants might lovingly, or perhaps dutifully, wire those teeth back in, or even add some fancier replacements, so they arrive in the great beyond looking their best. It's less about alleviating pain in this life, and more about presentation in the next, and the fluke idea. Sometimes things just look like fillings, but aren't. Compacted food debris, strange mineral deposits formed during decomposition, or even the remnants of an insect's nest. Oh, but nature is weird, could, with a very optimistic eye, be misinterpreted. So, when you see these pictures of ancient jaws with bits of gold or strangely packed teeth, you're looking at a genuine archaeological mystery. Were these ancient peoples ingeniously, if crudely, trying to fix their smiles and soothe their aches? Were they pioneers of prosthodontics, bravely experimenting with whatever materials they had to hand? Or are we projecting our modern dental desires onto ambiguous remains? It's a fascinating puzzle. One thing is for sure, if these were indeed attempts made on living, breathing, probably wincing patients, you'd need a will of iron and a very high pain threshold to undergo such a procedure. Your modern trip to the dentist for a filling, with all its precise instruments, anesthesia, and promises of a pain-free experience, suddenly seems like an absolute walk in the park, doesn't it? It's a testament, though, to that very human urge we talked about. The urge to mend, to restore, to make things whole again, even in the face of a throbbing, gaping hole where a tooth used to be. The desire for a full set of chompers, it seems, is as old as time itself. All right, so we've meandered through some truly, let's call them innovative, approaches to keeping those pearly whites, well, present. From dubious concoctions that probably tasted like regret, to extraction methods that make modern dentistry feel like a spa day. But a thought might be gently percolating in your mind, like a slow brewing herbal tea. How do we actually know all this? It's not as if these ancient folks were leaving detailed scrolls titled, "My Year in Dental Misadventures." Though, honestly, that's a bestseller I'd read. So now, you shift your gaze, moving away from the imagined practitioner and their slightly alarming toolkit, and you find yourself peering into the very source of our knowledge, the silent, stoic storytellers of the past, mummies and skeletal remains. This is where the real detective work begins, and you're about to meet the specialists who coax secrets from ancient bones. Imagine you're drifting into a space that's part laboratory, part hallowed tomb. It might be a hushed university department, filled with the gentle hum of climate control, or perhaps a temporary canvas-shaded outpost on the edge of a sun-baked excavation site. Here, you encounter the paleopathologists. These are the true bone whisperers, the scholars who read history, not in crumbling papyrus, but in the very fabric of human remains. They are the forensic scientists of antiquity, looking at lives lived centuries, even millennia ago, through the lens of health and disease. And their focus often, it's those surprisingly resilient little structures, the teeth and jaws. You watch as a paleopathologist, with an almost reverent gentleness, examines an ancient skull. Their tools might be as simple as a soft brush and a magnifying glass, or as advanced as a portable X-ray machine or a scanning electron microscope. They're not just looking at the teeth, they're looking into them, searching for the tales they hold. Each tooth is a tiny monument, a miniature archive of an individual's life. They're meticulously charting every chip, every cavity, every sign of wear. You can almost feel the faint, ghostly throb of an ancient toothache just by observing the subtle shadows on a jawbone that hint at a long-gone abscess. And what stories these teeth tell. They speak of diet, of course, one of the most common findings, a real mainstream fact. You'll see across countless ancient populations is severe dental attrition. That's a fancy way of saying their teeth are often worn incredibly flat, sometimes right down to the pulp. Now, this wasn't usually because they were all anxiously grinding their teeth over whether the latest oracle's prediction was good or bad. Remember all that stone-ground flour we talked about in earlier epochs? The grit from the grinding stones, the sand in their bread, the general unfiltered nature of their food acted like a slow, relentless sandpaper over their enamel. So, while they might have dodged some of the sugar-fueled cavity epidemics we face, they often traded it for this relentless, grinding wear. It's a bit like choosing between a sudden, sharp pain and a long, dull ache. Neither is exactly a party. Paleopathologists can also see the ghostly fingerprints of illnesses. Horizontal lines etched into the enamel, known as enamel hypoplasias, can tell you if an individual suffered from periods of severe malnutrition or illness during their childhood, when their teeth were still forming. It's like reading the rings of a tree, but instead of climate, you're seeing periods of hardship. They can assess bone loss around the tooth sockets to diagnose periodontal disease, gum disease, which, as we know, is no modern invention. It seems humanity has been battling tender, bleeding gums for a very, very long time. And sometimes, just sometimes, they find evidence of ancient dental interventions. A tooth with a neat, circular hole might suggest an attempt at drilling, perhaps with a bow drill, like we imagined earlier, to relieve the pressure of an abscess. Occasionally, though far more rarely, they might find a tooth packed with some ancient material, a primitive filling, or even, in exceptionally scarce cases, signs of wires used to stabilize loose teeth, a nascent form of orthodontics or bridge work. These are the moments that make a paleopathologist's heart beat a little faster, the tangible proof of ancient hands attempting to heal. Now for a slightly more specific, perhaps, quirky tidbit. Let's consider someone famous, someone whose smile, or lack thereof, has been preserved by the sands of time. Picture the great Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great. This was a man of immense power, responsible for some of Egypt's most colossal monuments. His mummy, a relic that has offered incredible insights, tells a tale of royal dental woes. Studies have revealed that in his later years, this mighty pharaoh suffered from some truly gnarly dental abscesses and severe periodontal disease. You can almost imagine him trying to maintain that majestic, god-king composure during important state functions, all while nursing a throbbing jaw that felt like it was hosting its own tiny angry sandstorm. It sort of humanizes these larger-than-life figures, doesn't it? Even pharaohs weren't immune to a rotten tooth. Perhaps all those grand statues were just his way of distracting everyone from his toothache. Look at my giant temple, not my swollen cheek. But this is where the interpretation becomes a delicate dance. We see the wear, the decay, the abscesses. We sometimes see what looks like an intervention. However, historians still argue whether the absence of widespread evidence for complex dental treatments means they were truly rare, or if such treatments simply didn't preserve well, or if our methods of detection are still evolving. Skeletal evidence provides a powerful, direct window, but it's not a complete picture. It's like finding a single, muddy footprint and trying to reconstruct the entire person, their journey, and what shoes they were wearing. We can infer much, but the full story, the patient's experience, the practitioner's intent, these often remain shrouded in the mists of time. Did that hole in the tooth truly alleviate pain? Or was it part of a ritual we don't understand? Without a post-it note from the past saying, "Ugh, drilled my tooth, feeling way better," a degree of uncertainty will always linger, soft and quiet, like dust settling in an ancient tomb. And so, as you drift deeper into this ancient world, you might find yourself idly rubbing your jaw, perhaps a phantom ache appearing, as we turn our thoughts to something universally relatable, a toothache. Tonight, let's explore Section 12, Dental Health Across Social Classes. Did your average farmer, toiling under the Egyptian sun, suffer the same dental woes as the high priest lounging in his cool riverside villa? Or was a good set of teeth, or at least less agonizing dental problems, another perk of being part of the ancient 1%? You can almost feel the grit, can't you? That persistent, sandy texture in every bite of bread. Remember how crucial bread was to the Egyptian diet, for everyone from the pharaoh down to the humblest laborer. Well, the way they prepared their grain, grinding it with stone tools, meant that tiny particles of sand and stone inevitably ended up in the flour. For the poor, whose diet consisted overwhelmingly of this coarse, gritty bread, the effect on their teeth was, shall we say, abrasive. It's like every loaf came with a free, unintentional tooth filing service. Their teeth wore down, sometimes dramatically, with cusps flattened and enamel eroded, often exposing the sensitive dentin underneath. You can just imagine the constant, dull ache, the wincing with every sip of cool water from the Nile. Now, you might think the rich, with their access to finer things, would have had it easier, and in some ways, they did. Their bread was likely made from more refined flour, meaning less of that tooth-destroying grit. They also had a more varied diet, not so reliant on bread alone. They enjoyed more meat, fish, fruits, and those delightful honey cakes we've touched upon. But here's where things get a bit tricky for them. Honey, the primary sweetener, and those sugary fruits, while delicious, are also fantastic fuel for cavity-causing bacteria. So, while the poor were grinding their teeth down, the rich might have been cultivating a different kind of dental disaster cavities, or caries, as the professionals call them. It's almost a case of picking your poison: relentless wear and tear, or sugary decay. This brings us to a pretty mainstream historical fact you'll encounter if you delve into paleopathology. Variations in dental health are often clearly observed in different burial populations. When archaeologists and anthropologists examine skeletal remains from distinct cemeteries, say, one known to be for common workers versus an elite necropolis, they often find telltale differences in the teeth. The workers might show that extreme attrition, teeth worn flat, while the nobles might display more evidence of cavities and abscesses, sometimes even before significant wear sets in. It's a silent testament, etched into bone, of vastly different lifestyles and diets. You can almost picture a team of ancient CSI investigators, only instead of fingerprints, they're looking at plaque buildup and enamel hypoplasia. Now, for a quirky tidbit. That flips the script a little while. The rich might have suffered more from decay due to sweeter foods. Some evidence suggests that certain elaborate attempts at dental treatment, however rudimentary, were more likely found among them. For instance, there are rare examples of attempts at stabilizing loose teeth with gold wire, essentially an early form of dental bridge. Imagine the status symbol. Oh, this old thing. Just a bit of gold to keep my tooth from defecting? Peasant problems. I wouldn't understand. It's a bit of an ironic twist, isn't it? The elite, with their access to luxuries like honey, were sometimes more prone to the kind of decay that might necessitate such interventions, while the poor, with their sandpaper bread, might have just lost teeth wholesale without any fancy gold wiring to commemorate the occasion. They probably just hoped the tooth fairy, or whatever Anubis's equivalent was for lost teeth, was feeling generous. This naturally leads us to the question of care. If your tooth was throbbing, what could you actually do about it in ancient Egypt? For the average person, options were likely grimly limited. Folk remedies, perhaps poultices made from herbs, or incantations to appease whatever angry god was presumed to be causing the pain. Extraction, if it happened, was probably a brutal affair, performed by someone with strong hands rather than specialized skill. Maybe the local carpenter who was good at pulling things. Their idea of a deep clean probably involved a stiff twig and a prayer, if they even bothered with that. We know they used frayed twigs as early toothbrushes, so there was some concept of oral hygiene, but its effectiveness, especially against that gritty diet, is debatable. For the wealthy, the situation might have been slightly better, but only slightly. Medical papyri do mention remedies for toothaches and gum problems, things like dough, honey, and onion mixtures to be applied, or various herbal rinses. Some of these ingredients, like honey, actually have antimicrobial properties, so they weren't entirely off base, even if they didn't understand the science. But actual, skilled dental intervention. That's where things get murky. Historians still argue whether specialized dental care, something akin to a dedicated dentist or tooth puller with specific training, was accessible only to the absolute elite, perhaps within the royal court, or if some level of recognized dental treatment was available more broadly, even if still limited to those with means. We see titles like Chief of Dentists or Palace Tooth Doctor associated with the Old Kingdom, suggesting a recognized specialty. But how many of these individuals existed, and who could actually afford their services? It's likely that for most, even those with some wealth, dental care was more about pain management than prevention or sophisticated repair. Living conditions also played a role, though perhaps less directly than diet. Access to cleaner water, better overall nutrition beyond just the grit-to-sugar ratio, and potentially more hygienic surroundings could have given the wealthy an edge in overall health, which in turn might have indirectly benefited their oral health by reducing systemic infections that could exacerbate dental problems. However, the primary culprits, that abrasive diet for the masses and sugary treats for the affluent, seem to be the biggest dividers when it comes to the smiles, or grimaces, of ancient Egyptians. It makes you appreciate your modern toothbrush and fluoride toothpaste, doesn't it? And maybe even your dentist, just a little. After all, open wide and say, "Ah," is probably a lot less terrifying than open wide and say, "Amun-Ra, please make it stop." The prevalence of dental abscesses, often visible in skeletal remains as holes near the tooth roots, tells a painful story for both rich and poor. These infections could be agonizing and, if left untreated, could even lead to systemic infection and death. Imagine that constant throbbing, the swelling, the fever, with no antibiotics and very limited options for relief. It's a stark reminder that even everyday ailments we now manage with relative ease could be life-threatening. So, whether you were feasting on honeyed dates in a palace or munching on a sandy barley loaf in a mud brick hut, your teeth were a constant source of potential misery. It's just that the type of misery might have differed depending on your social standing. One group grinds their teeth down to nubs, the other gets them riddled with sweet decay. Ancient Egyptian dental health, truly an equal opportunity afflictor, just with different specializations based on your paycheck, or, your grain allowance. So you're not feeling too grand. Maybe it's that nagging cough that rattles your ribs, or perhaps a tooth is throbbing with a vengeance, making even the softest bread feel like a stone. You seek out a healer, a Swingmin N'In or Senu, or perhaps a priest of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who could bring plague, but also cure it. It's all a bit interconnected here. You don't just get a diagnosis, you get an experience that blends the seen and the unseen, the earthly and the divine. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of incense, perhaps kai-fi, that complex calming blend we imagined earlier. The practitioner, after a careful examination, maybe prodding that sore tooth or listening to your chest, doesn't just reach for a jar of herbs. They might also consult a roll of papyrus, one of those fascinating medical texts we've touched upon. And here's the thing that might surprise your modern sensibilities. It's a well-established fact that many Egyptian medical papyri, like the famous Ebers papyrus, seamlessly blend what we'd call rational remedies with magical spells. One line might detail grinding specific minerals for a salve, the next an incantation to imbue that salve with divine power, or to banish the demon believed to be causing your sniffles. It's not an either-or situation. It's a yes and approach. The herbs deal with the physical manifestation. The spell deals with the underlying supernatural cause. You wouldn't want to leave either to chance, would you? Especially when your eternal well-being might be on the line, not just a pesky cold. So, the healer prepares a poultice for your aching jaw, perhaps with honey for its antibacterial properties. They knew a thing or two. even then, and some ground sycamore fig. But then, they might also select an amulet for you. You see these everywhere. Remember the Ankh for life, the Wedjat, Eye of Horus for protection and healing, the Scarab for rebirth, for a persistent ailment. They might craft a specific one, perhaps inscribing it with a short prayer or the name of a protective deity. You'd wear it around your neck, or it might be bound directly to the afflicted area, a constant, tangible connection to the divine, working its subtle magic while the herbs did their thing. It's like having a divine insurance policy alongside your physical treatment. Take 2 crushed figs and call me in the morning. And don't forget your hippo goddess charm, just in case. Then come the incantations. The healer, or a specialized lector priest, might lean in close, their voice a low murmur, chanting words that have been passed down for generations. These aren't just pretty poems. They're believed to hold real power, to command spirits, to appease gods, or to trick malevolent entities. If your illness is thought to be caused by, say, the anger of a lesser god, or the malicious intent of a ghost, then a physical remedy alone is like trying to fix a software bug by polishing your computer screen. You need the code. You need the magic words. The priest might address the illness directly. Flee sickness. Depart from this body. They might invoke powerful deities like Isis, the great magician, or Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, essentially the divine librarian, who probably wrote the original troubleshooting guide for human ailments. Let's talk about that throbbing tooth specifically, since we've peered into the rather enthusiastic world of early dentistry. Remember those bow drills? Yeah, ouch. Alongside whatever physical intervention might be deemed necessary. And let's be honest, that was often just waiting for it to fall out or a rather forceful extraction. Magic played a huge role. The ancient Egyptians, like many cultures, often believed that a toothache was caused by a worm gnawing at the tooth. So, a common treatment involved spells to exorcise this toothworm. And here's a quirky little tidbit. For you, the goddess Circuit, often depicted with a scorpion on her head, was a protectress against venomous stings and bites, because the toothworm was seen as a kind of malevolent biter. Spells to banish it sometimes invoked Circuit to use her power against this tiny, internal foe. You can almost picture the scene, the patient wincing, the dentist priest brandishing a rather alarming-looking bronze probe in one hand, while muttering an appeal to Circuit with the other. Oh, mighty Circuit, get this blasted worm out of here before I have to use this thing. It's multi-level marketing for your mouth. You might be wondering, as you sit there, clutching your newly prescribed amulet and still tasting the remnants of a slightly gritty herbal concoction, which part of this whole shebang is really doing the work? Is it the finely ground malachite, or the 7 repetitions of the spell to drive out the Ka demon of disease? This very question leads to a fascinating point of contention among those who study these ancient practices. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian patient, or even the practitioners themselves, placed more importance on the magical incantations and amulets than on the empirical remedies, or if they were always perceived as 2 equally vital sides of the same healing coin. Did they see the spell as the primary force, with the herbs as a helpful, but secondary assistant? Or was the physical treatment the main event, with the magic as a kind of spiritual supercharger, an added layer of divine oomph? It's tempting for us, with our modern scientific worldview, to dismiss the magical elements as mere superstition, tacked onto more sensible practices. But for the ancient Egyptian, the world was alive with unseen forces. Gods and spirits were as real as the Nile's current or the sun's heat. So, Addressing an illness without acknowledging its potential supernatural dimension would have seemed incomplete, perhaps even reckless. If a demon sent the fever, you couldn't just cool the skin. You had to banish the demon. If a god was displeased, you needed to make amends, not just take a pain reliever. So, as you leave the healer's space, perhaps your tooth still aches a bit, but you also carry a sense of reassurance. You have the herbs. You have the amulet. You've heard the sacred words. You've covered all your bases, from the material to the mystical. It's a holistic approach in the truest sense of the word, where the body, the mind, and the spirit are all part of the healing equation. And who knows, maybe that little chant does make the medicine work a bit better. Placebo effect, ancient Egyptian style. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they were tapping into something we've forgotten how to hear. A whisper of magic in the desert air. Either way, you're probably feeling a bit more hopeful. And in the face of ancient Egyptian dentistry, hope was a very, very good thing to have. So, you're picturing these ancient Egyptian dentists, perhaps with their impressive toolkits we peeked at earlier. And you're probably wondering, how did they even learn this stuff? It's not like they could just Google toothache remedies that don't involve an angry hippo goddess. Could they? The acquisition of dental knowledge, like much medical wisdom back then, was a fascinating blend of tradition, observation, and the slow, careful accumulation of what worked and what, well, really didn't. You drift now into a space where knowledge is a precious, almost sacred commodity. Imagine a young apprentice, eyes wide, following a seasoned Swenabo, one of those general physicians who also handled dental issues, or perhaps even a more specialized Ibhi, a palace tooth drawer, if the titles are anything to go by. This isn't a lecture hall with PowerPoint slides. Oh no, this is learning by watching, by listening intently as the master diagnoses a patient. Perhaps someone from the royal court, or a hard-working artisan, moaning about a throbbing jaw. You see the apprentice grinding herbs, preparing a poultice just as instructed, their hands mimicking the movements they've seen 100 times. This brings us to a rather charming, quirky tidbit. The bedrock of much of their training was almost certainly apprenticeship. Think of it as the original residency program, but with significantly more dust and probably fewer coffee breaks. A young hopeful would attach themselves to an established practitioner. Learning the craft over many years, they'd start with the basics, identifying common ailments from the descriptions in, say, the Ebers papyrus we've mentioned, learning which incantations accompanied which treatments, and mastering the art of reassuring a terrified patient. It's quite sweet. In a way, this direct line of knowledge transfer, master to student, generation after generation, one can almost hear the gentle, encouraging tones. No, no. Tilt the head this way when applying the honey and fig paste. You don't want it running into their good eye, unless they've been particularly annoying. Of course. Just kidding. Mostly. And where did the masters get their knowledge? Well, some of it was undoubtedly passed down orally. Family secrets, perhaps? Or closely guarded techniques within a certain temple or community? But the Egyptians, bless their record-keeping hearts, also wrote things down. You see scribes hunched over rolls of papyrus, their reed pens scratching away, meticulously copying medical texts. These weren't just casual notes. These were important documents, collections of remedies, case studies, and diagnostic observations. Remember those medical papyri we touched upon, like the Edwin Smith papyrus with its surprisingly surgical focus, or the Ebers papyrus, a veritable encyclopedia of ailments and their treatments, including a whole section on dental problems. These were the textbooks of their day? The role of these scribes is crucial. They weren't just copyists, they were preservers of knowledge, ensuring that remedies for toothworms, whether effective or not, and instructions for draining an abscess weren't lost to the sands of time. Imagine a house of life, the pharaoh abonas, often attached to a temple. This is our mainstream historical fact. For this section, these pharaoh institutions served as scriptoria, libraries, and centers of learning. While not medical schools in our modern, hyper-specialized sense, they were places where medical texts were created, stored, studied, and disseminated. You can almost smell the old papyrus, the dry desert air, and perhaps a hint of incense, as scholars and healers consulted these venerable scrolls. It's here that a promising young apprentice might be granted access to study these texts, to learn the accumulated wisdom of generations. Gaining expertise was a slow burn. It wasn't about a 4-year degree and a board exam. It was about years, decades even, of hands-on experience. You see the apprentice, now a junior practitioner, tentatively treating their first few patients under the watchful eye of their mentor. There would have been successes, moments of relief and gratitude from patients, and, inevitably, there would have been failures, lessons learned the hard way. Hopefully, not and too hard for the patient involved. Expertise was built on reputation. Word would spread, "Go see Nabaman, he has a gentle touch with the drill," or "Avoid Amenhotep. His breath alone could knock out a diseased tooth, never mind his instruments." Arcade, a successful practice, meant a steady stream of patients, and with each patient, more experience, more refinement of technique. They learned to recognize patterns, to associate certain symptoms with certain conditions, much like doctors do today. They'd observe the color of the gums, the nature of the swelling, the type of pain described. They'd then refer to their memorized knowledge, or perhaps even consult a papyrus if they were literate and had access, to find a corresponding treatment. It was a combination of empirical observation and reliance on established textual authority, even if that authority sometimes recommended, say, fumigating the mouth with henbane seeds to expel a mythical toothworm. Hey, you work with what you've got. But how deep did their understanding really go? They could clearly identify problems, and they had a range of treatments, some surprisingly practical, others less so. They knew about drilling into teeth to relieve pressure, about draining abscesses, about using rudimentary fillings, or splinting loose teeth, as we've discussed. But historians still argue whether their anatomical understanding, particularly of the intricate structures within the jaw and teeth, was based on systematic dissection or purely on external observation and experience with injuries. The religious prescriptions against extensive mutilation of the dead, essential for mummification to preserve the body for the afterlife, might have limited their opportunities for detailed anatomical study in the way that later Greek or Renaissance physicians pursued it. So, while they could see a hole in a tooth or feel a swelling in the jaw, did they truly understand the nerve pathways, the exact structure of the tooth root, or the complex interplay of the temporomandibular joint? It's a point of ongoing scholarly discussion. Their treatments suggest a practical, problem-solving approach rather than a deeply theoretical one. If something worked, they kept doing it, and they taught others to do it too. It's like your grandma's secret recipe for cough syrup. She might not know the precise chemical interactions, but she knows it makes you feel better, and that's what counts. You can imagine the immense satisfaction when a treatment actually worked, when a patient's agony subsided thanks to their intervention. That's a powerful motivator for learning, for honing one's skills. And it's this gradual, painstaking accumulation of knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, recorded by diligent scribes, and tested through countless trials and, yes, errors, that formed the very foundation of Egyptian dental practice. It wasn't perfect, It certainly wasn't painless by our standards, but it was a start, a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring desire to alleviate suffering, one aching tooth at a time. The quiet hum of the pharaoh, the focused gaze of the apprentice, the authoritative voice of the master, these are the sounds and sights of knowledge being forged in the ancient world. And so, as the sands of our journey through ancient Egyptian mouths begin to settle, you find yourself in this final chamber of reflection, a space filled with echoes of their achievements and the soft whisper of unanswered questions. You're seeing now, aren't you, how their dentistry, while not quite the gleaming Hollywood smile factory we might imagine, was remarkably advanced for its era, a curious blend of the practical and the profoundly mystical. We've peered into those ancient skulls. Remember? We saw the telltale signs of their daily grind, literally, with teeth worn flat from the grit in their bread. A problem far more common than the cavities that plague our sugar-soaked modern diets. Yet, they weren't strangers to the throb of a toothache, the swelling of an abscess, or the misery of periodontal disease. You can almost feel the phantom ache yourself, can't you? Their response, as we've explored, was multifaceted. They knew how to drain those painful pus-filled abscesses, a procedure that, even if rudimentary, must have brought immense relief. Extractions, well, those were certainly on the table, likely a last resort and probably not a spa day experience, but a necessary evil performed with the tools they had, those bronze probes and forceps we glimpsed. Imagine the scene, no modern anesthetics, just perhaps a gulp of beer mixed with a sedative herb, a strong pair of hands, and a prayer to Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and destruction, which feels rather apt for an ancient tooth pulling. They also dabbled in what you might call early orthodontics or prosthetics, those intriguing examples of teeth bound with gold wire or linen thread. Were these functional, helping to stabilize a loose tooth, or perhaps supporting a rudimentary bridge made from a donor tooth? Or were they, as some suspect, more cosmetic, or even post-mortem additions to ensure a complete smile for the journey into the afterlife? It's one of those tantalizing glimpses into a practice that was clearly evolving. And let's not forget the herbal remedies, the poultices and rinses described in the papyrus, meant to soothe inflamed gums or ward off infection, often accompanied by magical incantations, because in ancient Egypt, you didn't just treat the body, you treated the spirit, and you definitely wanted to appease whichever mischievous demon or deity was thought to be causing the dental distress. Remember the infamous toothworm theory we touched upon? A pervasive belief that a tiny worm gnawing away inside the tooth was the culprit. It's easy to chuckle now, but it shows their attempt to find a tangible cause for an invisible ailment. Reflecting on these practices, you start to see a clearer picture of their society, the very existence of specialized dental practitioners, the Heziri figures we encountered, individuals recognized as dealing with the teeth, tells you that dental health wasn't entirely ignored. It implies a society with enough surplus in organization to support specialized medical roles, at least for the elite. The care they took with the mummified remains, sometimes including intricate dental work, speaks volumes about their beliefs in the afterlife and the importance of preserving the body intact, a perfect smile for eternity. Perhaps it also hints at social stratification. It's unlikely that the average farmer received the same level of dental attention as a noble or a priest. Their medical understanding, as revealed through texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, shows a surprisingly rational approach to trauma and diagnosis in many areas, and some of this empirical observation undoubtedly extended to dental problems. They could clearly recognize inflammation, infection, and the progressive nature of some dental diseases. They understood that certain substances could alleviate pain or reduce swelling. But then, you also sense their limitations, vast and formidable, Without the understanding of germ theory, asepsis was non-existent. Infection following any intervention must have been a constant, deadly risk. Anesthesia, as we know it, was centuries away. Their pain management would have relied on opiates from poppies, mandrake, or simply a strong constitution and perhaps a bit of divine distraction. Their tools, though ingenious for their time, were crude by our standards, limiting the precision and scope of any procedure. They could pull a tooth, drain an abscess, maybe try to splint a loose one, but complex restorations, root canals, or sophisticated surgical interventions were far beyond their reach. Their knowledge of caries etiology was, as we mentioned, based on the toothworm myth rather than an understanding of bacteria and sugar. It's a poignant reminder of how far we've come, standing on the shoulders of these ancient investigators who did their best with the knowledge and tools available, often working in a hazy twilight between science and superstition. And the mysteries. Oh, the mysteries that still linger, as pervasive and subtle as the scent of ancient incense. You lean in, trying to decipher the unwritten chapters. What was the actual training regimen for these dental practitioners? Was it a formal apprenticeship, knowledge passed down through guilds, or a closely guarded family secret? The papyri give us lists of remedies and some case descriptions, but the how-to of many procedures remains frustratingly vague. How effective were those gold wire appliances? Did they truly allow someone to chew better? Or were they more symbolic? Remember those skulls with holes drilled into the jawbone near the root of an aching tooth? A desperate attempt to relieve pressure. Perhaps? But what was the thought process? The precise technique? It's like trying to assemble a particularly complex piece of IKEA furniture with only a few pictograms and a bronze chisel. You get the general idea, but the fine details are lost to the ages. Despite these gaps, their legacy is undeniable. It's a mainstream historical fact that the medical knowledge codified in Egyptian papyri AE, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the aforementioned Edwin Smith Papyrus, didn't just vanish into the desert sands. This knowledge, covering everything from surgical procedures to pharmacy, was highly respected in the ancient world and significantly influenced the development of Greek and, subsequently, Roman medicine. Think of figures like Hippocrates and Galen. They built upon foundations laid, in part, by these Nile Valley healers. So, when you consider the long arc of medical history, those ancient Egyptian physicians and their dental counterparts were indeed early pioneers, their observations and remedies forming some of the first written chapters in humanity's long struggle against disease and decay. Now, for a truly quirky tidbit that still keeps dental anthropologists and Egyptologists gently debating over their fanced cups of tea, the mystery of the missing link in dental prosthetics. We see some mummies with teeth cleverly wired together, sometimes with donor teeth or ivory ponics included. But there's a fascinating lack of widespread, definitively functional and complex bridgework or dentures that you might expect from such an advanced civilization that clearly valued aesthetics and bodily integrity for the afterlife. The question isn't just if they could conceptualize more advanced replacements, but why? We don't see more evidence of them being used by the living. Was the technology just not quite there for durable, everyday use? Or was it so rare that examples haven't survived or been found? Perhaps the pain and difficulty of creating and fitting such devices outweighed the benefits for most. It's like they were almost on the verge of modernish dentistry, but something held them back. A tiny, frustrating gap in the historical record. Imagine them almost inventing dental implants, but getting distracted by a particularly shiny scarab beetle. This, naturally, leads us to a broader, ongoing discussion within the scholarly community. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' dental advancements, particularly in areas like attempted tooth stabilization or early exodontia, truly placed them on a unique pinnacle compared to other ancient civilizations, or if our perception is significantly amplified by the sheer volume and remarkable preservation of their mummies and written records. It's a crucial point. Consider the Indus Valley Civilization or early medical practices in China or Mesopotamia. They too were wrestling with human ailments, including dental ones. Did they have equally, or perhaps differently, sophisticated approaches that simply didn't survive in such a visible, tangible way? The dry climate of Egypt was a phenomenal preservative, giving us a treasure trove. But absence of evidence elsewhere isn't necessarily evidence of absence of skill. Perhaps another culture excelled in herbal pain relief that left no archaeological trace, or developed preventative dietary wisdom that we can only guess at. It's a healthy debate that reminds us to be cautious about proclaiming any single ancient culture as universally superior in all aspects of early medicine. Their story, etched in bone and papyrus, tells us of a people who, faced with the universal human experience of dental pain, responded with ingenuity, observation, and a touch of magic. They didn't conquer all their dental demons, not by a long shot, but they certainly didn't ignore them. They laid down some of the earliest foundations upon which millennia of dental science would eventually be built. And now, as our exploration of these ancient echoes draws to a close, allow the images and sounds to soften, to recede gently like the Nile's floodwaters returning to their banks. Feel the warmth of the torchlight dimming, the cool night air of the desert beginning to settle around you, carrying the faintest scent of myrrh and time itself. The voices of the scribes, the gentle tapping of the artisan's tools, the whispered incantations of the physician priest, they all fade into a comforting, peaceful quiet. Let your own breath deepen, slowly, rhythmically, carrying away any lingering tension, any disquiet from these tales of ancient aches and rudimentary remedies. You are safe, you are comfortable, and the vastness of history simply cradles you in its immense, quiet embrace. The lingering questions, the unsolved puzzles, they too can rest now, suspended in the gentle starlight of the Egyptian sky, waiting for another time, another curious mind. For tonight, there is only peace and the soft, steady rhythm of your own quiet breathing as you drift, fade to black